the warning that yes, we are being recorded. It's set up so that only the people who speak will come up on the recording. But I suppose just as a caveat, if anyone would rather not appear on such, you can switch your camera off. Um, but yes, thank you for joining us. Tonight, we are happy to have my colleague, or our colleague, Dr. Lucy Dean, speaking to us. Lucy is a lecturer here at the Centre for History at UHI, who focuses on the medieval and early modern periods in Scotland and beyond. Her research, publications, and teaching focus on ritual, ceremony, kingship, material culture, and she's increasingly working on issues of gender, particularly masculinity, and the life cycle, with a focus on youth and old age. Her first monograph, Death and the Royal Succession in Scotland, 1214 to 1543, Ritual, Ceremony and Power, will be published later this year. Exciting. She's also passionate about taking history beyond the academy and has been module leader on our public history module now for over 4 years. And she's worked with Historic Environment Scotland, the Royal Collections Trust, National Museum Scotland, and Culture of Perth and Kinross, including contributing to the advisory committee for the reinterpretation of the Stone of Destiny when it moves to Perth in 2024. And she's also co-investigator on a collaborative public history project centred on the lost Carthusian monastery in the medieval Royal Centre at Perth, with Richard Oram of the University of Stirling, Culture, Perth and Kinross, and other local partners. And it's her work on this project that she'll be speaking about tonight with her paper entitled Connections and Memories, Domus Vallis Virtutis and the Burgh of Perth. So over to you, Lucy.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to sort my PowerPoint out because it's decided it wants to show you the presenter's version instead of my version. Give me 1 second.
That's you, Lucy.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. So when a building is lost from a townscape, memories or its existence continue to resonate long after the physical loss of that building. Buildings are not mere stones and mortar, nor even their elaborate decoration. They are active material spaces. They are shaped by the communities that interact with them and influence those around them. They provide spaces for fostering connections and harbouring disputes. And through the cultural associations with and human experiences of them, they become meaningful places that can survive in memory once the physical has been removed. The lost building at the heart of this paper and the wider project it's associated with is the Domus Vallis Virtutis, or the House of the Vale or Valley of Virtue, more commonly known in modernity as the Carthusian Priory or Charterhouse in, or at the time near, Perth. A monastic foundation built in the 15th century, it was a victim of the Reformation, with no above-ground physical remains in the modern Perth landscape today. The paper will briefly introduce the Perth Charterhouse project before discussing the ideas of connections and memories in 3 ways. Firstly, it'll provide initial research into the location and material space that the Carthusian Charterhouse, without the south gates of Perth, inhabited, commenting on the community that functioned within it and the reach of its influence, interactions and connections in and with the borough. Secondly, it speaks to the echoes of the community and the foundation in the centuries after the physical building was destroyed to consider what it can tell us about connections and memories as association with location, positional or relational, space, meaning the material, and place, thinking about meaningful, using Leaf Sharam's definitions of these 3 terms. In closing, this paper will comment on the potential of lost historical sites to act as a catalyst to bring modern communities together in rediscovering and creating memories and rekindling meaningful connections to place. The Perth Charterhouse project began its life in February 2017, coinciding with the memorial date for the murder of James I, who reigned from 1406 to 1437, who was also the royal founder of the Carthusian Charterhouse at Perth. The collaboration on this project is with Professor Richard Oram at the University of Stirling and local partners including Culture, Perth and Kinross, who I'll refer to as CPK for the rest of the talk, and Perth and Kinross Heritage Trust, with some involvement from Paul Wilson and the Glasgow School of Art, School of Simulation and Visualisation, definitely in the earlier years of the project. The project seeks to re-establish understanding of Perth's central role in later medieval Scotland for and with a wider, particularly local, public audience, underpinned by a keen interest in further exploring the potential value and importance of reconnection to place through shared explorations and interpretation of the city's medieval heritage. The city's fabulous material and archival collections for this period, which are managed, curated and cared for by CPK through the Perth and Kinross Archive, the AK Bell Library, Perth Museum and Art Gallery, and the soon-to-be-opened Perth City Hall Museum, sit at the heart of this project. Our activities centre around raising the profile of these collections, particularly the late medieval and early modern archival collections, which are underused and inconsistently catalogued. In doing so, we aim to support CPK's objectives in collaboration with them around building better collections knowledge, reaching and engaging new and wider audiences for those collections, and creating more integration of the archival record with the extensive object collections held by the museum. The Carthusian Charterhouse, the only Carthusian monastery to have been built or founded in Scotland, was identified as an important lost medieval icon representative of Perth's once crucial position in a national narrative around which to centre the project. It was founded by James I during a whirlwind of royal activity following the king's return to Scotland aged 30 in 1424 after 18 years of captivity in England. For those not familiar with the story of James I's early life, he was kidnapped aged 12 and taken by pirates to the Lancastrian King of England, Henry IV. James I's ailing father, Robert III, died shortly after, aged 68, meaning that James was now king, but he was also imprisoned and wouldn't receive his crown until 1424 when he was released. In the interim, Scotland was ruled by his uncle, Robert Stewart, Duke of Albany and Earl of Fife, until his own death in 1420. James I's return to Scotland witnessed demonstrable efforts by the king to reinstate his royal authority and status, including a flurry of royal building activity. The Carthusian Charterhouse, intended as a royal mausoleum for James I and his English wife Joan Beaufort, and both were ultimately buried there, was one of the two main building projects alongside the palace at Linlithgow. The Carthusian order was characterized by a desire for solitary existence and prayer, so they lived as collective hermits with individual houses and gardens, as you can see in the picture of Mount Grace, which is the sort of slightly more grainy one on the left. If you look to the left of the church, there's a square courtyard, and each of the foundations you can see a square with a smaller square in it, and that was their house within a courtyard that had their own garden space. Founded in late 11th century France, with the Grand Chartreuse near Grenoble, which is the picture at the top, which is still a functioning Carthusian house, the order had a resurgence of popularity during the post-plague era, when houses were founded in England, including the London Charterhouse, founded in the late 14th century, and Sheen Priory and Mount Grace Priory in Yorkshire, founded in the 15th century. Also, there were houses founded in Burgundy, including the mausoleum of the Dukes of Burgundy at Champnol near Dijon. Selecting one of the most austere religious orders for the first royal monastic foundation to introduce a new monastic order to Scotland since before the Wars of Independence was a statement of James's personal piety, the divine nature of his kingship, and the power and wealth of the monarchy in Scotland at that time. Despite some notable exceptions, including the London Charterhouse, Carthusian foundations were usually located in isolated rurality, such as Grenoble and Mount Grace in Yorkshire. They're far away from anybody else. So this also made this foundation more exceptional. The choice of Perth over other boroughs in Scotland for this royal foundation reflected concentrated efforts from the mid-14th century onwards to centralise government, court and ceremony around the royal centre at Perth and Scone. Parliaments, general councils and meetings of the Royal Exchequer regularly took place at Perth during the late 14th and early 15th centuries. It was also a common meeting place of the Church Council and a busy port, as the River Tay was navigable up to the town at that time. Yet the place of Perth in the history of medieval Scotland and the place of the Charterhouse in Perth's history are things about which there is still much to learn and communicate, particularly into a wider public historical narrative. Most of our activities thus far have been associated with building better collections knowledge and engaging new and wider audiences with those collections, including a series of collaborative workshops and events with Culture Perth and Kinross, and working with the Perth City Hall Champions, a volunteer group, and also doing outreach with schools. However, the project has faced some challenges, including setbacks in securing funding, but perhaps most disruptively and particularly is the marked impact of the pandemic and associated lockdowns, both due to the public-facing nature of the project and the understandable redirecting of potential financial support to urgent pandemic-related issues. However, in May 2020, we held a twice postponed event originally designed to be part of a series of events in the spring and summer of 2020, which was supported in part by UHI's Knowledge Exchange Challenge Fund to reinvigorate the project and our collaboration with Culture Perth and Kinross following the pandemic. Involving a number of undergraduate and postgraduate student volunteers, I think at least one of which is in the audience this evening, the event was a one-day public hybrid symposium bringing together experts on the Charterhouse, Mount Grace Priory in North Yorkshire, James I, and also the Carthusian Order and their culture in Scotland and the British Isles more generally, and a complementary archival exhibition titled From Foundations to Echoes in the Records, The Charterhouse and Its Place in Perth, which was collaboratively orchestrated by myself and Sarah Wilcock, the assistant archivist at the AK Bell. This paper has been developed from my contribution to that event, incorporating reflections on the exhibition and the project aims. On the 1st of July 1914, a monument was raised by the Historic Sites Committee of Perth to commemorate the Carthusian Charterhouse as part of a concerted effort by the Town Council to recognise and mark some of the town's lost historic buildings. The monument stands near the James VI Hospital on the corner where Hospital Street meets King Street. The map and the aerial view from Canmore illustrate the hospital's position at the edge of the old town of Perth. There are no contemporary extant illustrations, drawings or maps surviving from the 15th or 16th centuries illustrating the original Charterhouse, so many presumptions have been made about the hospital representing the extent of the Charterhouse. However, comparative Carthusian houses, as I've shown in previous pictures, covered large tracts of land due to the need for individual cells and gardens to accommodate the isolated manner of living that the Carthusian order required. So as can be seen in this reconstruction drawing based on the standing remains and archaeological work at Mount Grace Priory in Yorkshire, here the Great Cloister had 16 individual cells with later overflow added around the Little Cloister, which is the other side of the church. According to the founding licence of the Charterhouse at Perth, It was founded for 13 monks initially, 12 monks and a prior, and appears to have housed as many as 14 monks and a prior on some occasions. To accommodate even 13 monks in individual housing suggests that Mary Black-Vachos was correct to conclude that we have long underestimated the physical size of the Charterhouse at Perth. Julian Luxford, who's an expert on the Carthusian order in the British Isles, has expressed caution in using Mount Grace as a template for Perth, and such caution is sensible. Surviving examples of Carthusian houses in England alone show variances in the arrangements of the greater and lesser cloisters, and also the inner courts. And Mount Grace's piecemeal construction and the topography of the site led to quite an unusual shape for the precinct. However, there is also evidence that monks from Mount Grace would have been in a position to influence the design of the Charterhouse at Perth, as the prior of Mount Grace, Thomas Lockrington, and another monk, Brother Bryce, were sent to assess the site at Perth and the endowments being offered in 1429, and Bryce received 100 nobles directly from the Crown for his services. The shape and design of the house at Perth would have been such as to fit the space available, and the original Great Cloister was for slightly fewer monks than the design that we can see here on the screen. But taking Mount Grace as a rough size guide allows us to consider the potential size that the precinct could have covered if we look back at a map of Perth. With colleagues at Perth and Kinross Heritage Trust, we layered an estimation of the size of Mount Grace over the relevant section of Perth, just to get an idea of the area that we might be dealing with if we were going to understand it better in the modern landscape for any scanning or archaeological investigations that we might be dealing with. As you can see, even if the roads in the 18th century hospital gardens are used as an additional guide in relation to the borough, this would have been a very large site, perhaps as much as a third of the borough's size, and would have dominated that physical space outside the gates of the town. Initial investigations into more specifics about the physical space that the Charterhouse occupied were initially undertaken during 2017 to 2019 via the records of the King James VI Hospital, which are held at the National Records in Edinburgh. This was with thanks to the funding from Geoffrey Barrow Award, and also with thanks to the hospital managers for permission to take photographs of those documents. The collection included a founding license, original charters, tax, instruments of seizin and resignation, a rental list and information on donations, both before and after the Reformation, some of which include important information about the positional location and physical boundaries of the space due to the nature of some of the documents. Charters relating to land ownership and letters of tack and seizin, i.e. rental agreements, often seek to clarify where a particular tenement or packet of land is situated in relation to other lands owned by others, and sometimes, joyously, although not that often, it refers to specific landmarks. For example, documents relating to one of the initial grants of land, a croft of William de Wind, on which part of the foundation was built, identify the main road leading from the south gate of the town to St Leonard's Hospital as the western boundary of the Charterhouse land. However, 16th century letters of tack from the prior and brothers leases orchards and arable land between the walls of the Charterhouse precinct and the common road to St Leonard's to Thomas Fleming, who was a burgess of the town. This confirms that there was a strip of farmed orchard land between the Charterhouse and the road that was not part of the precinct of the monastic space. This area was known as Pomerium, reflecting its purpose as an orchard, and has notably retained this name into the present day, despite now largely being covered in tarmac, housing the bus station and also several blocks of flats. The Carthusians gradually acquired substantial property. This included land and leases in the New Row, which is marked now on the slide, and descriptions of the properties on this road often refer to that common road as the south boundary. However, each described this road, so the road running from the gate down to St Leonard's, as both leading to St Leonard's and the house of the Carthusians, suggesting perhaps that the gatehouse to the Carthusian precinct was on the west side away from the town. This initial research also offered evidence regarding potential water supplies to the Charterhouse. This is an image of an information board from Mount Grace, where a complex water system was installed to provide both clean water for drinking and also water for washing away waste from individual latrines. And the monks from this house advised on the planning at the Perth Foundation. The original grant of James I's Charterhouse, surviving in a 16th century confirmation, gives permission to create a water channel to carry water from the town mill dam or lathe to the Charterhouse. We know that a conduit was built, coming off the town lathe, due to the surviving letter from James III in 1470 responding to the Carthusians' complaints against men of the borough for damaging the conduit from the town lathe, which confirms that by 1470 at least there was a conduit and it could be broken. Later 15th and 16th century grants and leases of properties on the east side of New Row also refer to public ponds and an aqueduct or construction conducting water running along these lands as an eastern boundary. This confirms that water was directed towards the Charterhouse from the lathe in close proximity to these houses, perhaps to provide water in a very similar system to that found at Mount Grace. Unlike Mount Grace, however, Perth Charterhouse was, relatively unusually, situated in very close proximity to the town itself. As the complaints regarding the destruction of the water conduit indicate, this put them in close contact with the people of the borough, and through research into the hospital collection and subsequent initial explorations of complementary records at the Perth and Kinross archive, this next section of the paper seeks to make some tentative initial comments on the reach and influence of the Charterhouse and its relationship with the borough. As Victoria Hodgson's research into the conflict between the Cistercian house of Cooper Angus, a little way away from Perth, and the Carthusian house at Perth over a chapel in the parish of Errol has identified, the Carthusian Charterhouse in Perth was a substantial land and property owner which actively and rigorously sought to secure their rights to gifted land and property, which they often came into dispute with others about. Even a brief survey of the charters and rental agreements held in the James VI Hospital records alone indicate that the Carthusian presence in and around the borough itself would have been notably marked. These documents indicate lands, yards, booths, tenements, all under control of the Carthusians around 4 of the borough gates, the South Gate, North Gate, Watergate and the Spey Gate. As well as this, they had properties around the Turret Brig Port, tenements on some of the borough's vennels, including the Meal Vennel, and holdings covering much of the south-east of the lands out with the borough, including the lands of Leonardsley, the lands around the Hospital of St Leonard's, the Whore of St Leonard's and the Long Causeway. And this is without considering other interests further afield, such as the disputed chapel at Errol and a stone quarry near Craigie. The work of Eldred Hogg has noted that at least 6 of the monks at the Charterhouse in Perth were commended with the highest order of praise, meaning that they were those that lived the most praiseworthy lives in the order, by the Grand Chartreuse between 1519 and 1569. He notes particularly how remarkable this was, as between when records began and 1929, only 1,300 monks have ever received this commendation, and 6 of these were awarded to one house in Scotland in one 50-year period. However, while the monks were achieving such praise, Verschuur's work on Perth in the decades leading up to the Reformation has demonstrated that some of the 16th century Carthusian priors, such as Simon Galloway and Adam Foreman, were proactive, even a bit ruthless, in contesting and securing their rights within and around the borough that allowed these monks to maintain that praiseworthy existence. As with most of Perth's mendicant religious foundations, and there were a few, the presence and influence of the key members of the Carthusian community, specifically their prior and lay agents, would have been keenly felt by many people in the borough, as they would have either gifted money or property to them, rented from them, or been in dispute with them about something. This proactivity in maintaining and managing properties and landholdings was something that brought the people of the town into the Carthusian precinct itself as well. For example, two of the documents dated 1545, showcased From Foundations to Echoes in the Records exhibition, relating to Leonardslee or Leonardslee, which is on the south side of the monastery, confirms lands that were held by Andrew Colt and Violet, his spouse, and also confirms subletting of part of the same lands. But they were penned and witnessed in the place of the Charterhouse, or in our said place, by Simon Galloway, the prior, overseeing the agreements being made along with other town officials. This type of detail within these legal documents thus offers important insights into the role of the prior and the physical spaces of the Charterhouse being used to conduct business as well as prayer and contemplation. Indeed, there is more evidence surviving in the records consulted to this stage for these sorts of activities rather than those that the monks were undertaking in their daily contemplative lives. However, these types of documents can give us some insight into some of the other members of the community as well as the prior alone, as there are instances, particularly in the 16th century, where charters and other agreements survive with each of the individual monks named on them. For example, the 1529 charter by James Davidson, the presbyter, founding a chapelry and altar in honour of St Leonard Abbot at the chapel of St Leonard's, situated on the south side of the Charterhouse, includes the signatures of 13 monks, including the prior. This suggests either interaction by all these monks with the wider community, particularly with those documents with different hands for each signature, or that each monk was individually consulted to acquire his agreement to the document, which is perhaps more likely in cases where the signatures are all in a similar hand, like the document that's photographed on the slide. As well as offering the names of these monks at this time, which can offer avenues into researching individuals potentially, they also signed including any roles or positions that they held within the community, including the prior, who was called Hugh, the vicar, who was William Sewell, the procurator, who was Robert, and the sacristan, who was John Burnet, which can help us to build up an understanding of the ways that the community functioned within the monastery as well. The functioning of the community during the time that the monastery was active and the material spaces that they inhabited are central to this research, but the manner in which the place was destroyed, dispersed, forgotten, and remembered are just as important to appreciating the Charterhouse's place in Perth's history, and that's what the rest of the paper will focus on. Oh, changed that too soon. As Douglas Somerset has explored, the attacks on religious houses in and around Perth in 1559 were devastating to the built fabric of medieval monastic houses. However, as the Carthusian community was entrenched in the local society, both in terms of the institution's land and property ownership, and through direct personal interactions, whether as mediators to agreements or actively involved in disputes, it's perhaps unsurprising that the Reformation did not draw a neat line under things. There is a fascinating volume of surviving evidence in the James VI Hospital records and the Perth and Kinross archive collections as to the way that some members of the community continued to function within Perth society and beyond into the subsequent decades after 1559. Verschoor states that there were 10 monks and a prior resident in the Charterhouse in 1559, and that roughly half of the community remained in Perth, while the rest of them left for France. She concludes that while Adam Foreman, the prior at the time of the attack on the Carthusian Charterhouse, remained in Scotland, the community that were there remained with him and continued to function. They settled at a house in Errol, but after Adam Foreman's departure to France in 1567, that community, she states, open quote, no longer existed, close quote. However, there is evidence to suggest the remaining monks, some of whom were granted tenements in Perth from the Charterhouse holdings, still considered themselves to be part of the community despite their disbanding, and perhaps more interestingly, that others still considered them thus. The Glovers Incorporation records in Perth's archive pertaining to the lands of Leonardsley between 1574 and 1577, also showcased in our exhibition, refer to the Charterhouse in a manner that makes it hard to imagine that the foundation no longer exists. Moreover, George Balfour, who was the commendator and as such a lay administrator who took charge of the monastery's remaining properties and rents, often titled himself as prior in these same documents. One document in particular, from 1575, records actions taken against the Colts, father and son, by George MacGregor, also known as Johnson, which makes it quite hard to follow these documents and what's going on, and provide insights into the community of monks who, though dispersed, were actively involved in the affairs of the Charterhouse and its lands. This particular document records that James Meek, a monk of the house then living in the Kirkton of Errol, was holding a charter in his possession relating to these lands, while they waited for two other monks, Andrew Blythman and James Sim, to be present to sign the agreement. Although the document ultimately relays that the Colts and their associates hoodwinked Meek to retrieve the document for their own ends, it's interesting that it consistently talks about him and the other monks of that said place continuing the same kind of language that was being used when the Charterhouse was in existence. Even as late as 1585, long after the eve of the Reformation and Adam Foreman's departure for France, George Balfour confirmed yearly payments from tenants around the site of the former Charterhouse for life for one of the members of the Carthusian community, James Sim. The most interesting thing here is not that the monks were being supported into their old age, but rather that the language used to describe both the monk, he was being described as a brother and professate monk of our said place, and the land, firth of the boundaries of our place of the Charterhouse, suggests continuing feelings of belonging to our place of the Charterhouse, even if the buildings they had once inhabited had been destroyed. This choice and use of the phrase of our place speaks to meaningful human connections to the entity that once was, and speaks to Durham's suggestions that open quote place, crucially, need not have a geographical location at all, close quote, as it is not about physical space, but about the human experiences of that space. The fact that the monk and the others communicating with him and about him still referred to him as a brother or brother of the house also speak to the importance of the shared history and experience of that place that David Glassberg argues allows us, open quote, disparate individual and groups to envision themselves as members of a collective, even when that place is no longer functioning in the same means as it had been previously. Despite the loss of the building, and eventually following the deaths of the remaining monks and community, the Carthusian Charterhouse echoes through the documentary evidence that records land and property ownership in the decades and centuries which followed. Illustrating the way that these echoes permeate the collections at Perth and Kinross Archive was one of the primary drivers behind the From Foundations to Echoes in the Records exhibition. The collections hold a really interesting range of evidence to better understand the Charterhouse and its relationship with the borough over time, both while it existed as a physical entity and after its destruction during the Reformation. However, unlike the records of the King James VI Hospital, which are nicely collated into one collection of documents, the records in the exhibition were drawn from across a variety of collections within the Perth Archive records, including the records of the Glovers Incorporation, who were granted large portions of former Charterhouse lands, the borough records, including sub-collections on legal affairs, ecclesiastical affairs, and military affairs, the Robert Scott Fittis papers, and some of the miscellaneous collections within the archive as well. The selected documents were just a sample of those found to offer snapshots across the centuries from the earliest document relating to the Charterhouse located at the archive so far, through to the raising of the Charterhouse monument in 1914 and the use of the Charterhouse seal on a business card later in the 20th century. Such echoes in the documents can perhaps be largely put down to legal associations of place passed down over time that speak to the delineation of physical locations, property, material spaces, and monetary income. For example, the discharges that record the provision of the part of the stipend of the minister, John Roe, in the late 16th and early 17th century, specifically record the payments were once paid to the Charterhouse, as this gave historical legacy to the endowments and legal standing by which to be able to identify the origin of the payment. However, there are some records that suggest more in the way of associations with potential material remnants of the building itself, such as in a 1633 ordinance by the Kirk Session of Perth recording that a dowcot or a dovecot in the precinct of the Charterhouse, which was ruined and occupied by crows and other undesirable birds, so the orders were being made that that the minister, John Robertson, was to repair this house for doves and make it profitable. Does this reference to the precinct of the Charterhouse mean that there was physical remains that materially delineated this space in 1633, or was it just a continuing association with the memory of what had stood in that location previously? If so, why did it continue to resonate? The legal battles over the Charterhouse properties, lands, rental entitlements, and such forth certainly continue into the 18th century, as the Presbytery, incorporated trades, and borough officials continue to dispute the legality of who should have had what, and the rights are still associated with this entity despite its destruction over 200 years earlier. But at what point did that cease? The records of the Perth and Kinross archive suggest that the rapid development in this area of Perth in the 19th century, particularly when it became part of the borough rather than being considered outside it, was a point at which such obvious associations begin to dwindle, but it's definitely something that I need to do more research into. One thing that is certain, however, was that by the early 20th century, all religious sites, the Charterhouse included, were deemed to have been lost to the collective memory of Perth to the extent that memorials needed to be raised to remind and restore them to local memory as important aspects of a collective past. This speaks to Glasbow's proposition that, open quote, historical consciousness and place consciousness are inextricably intertwined, close quote. As the town council hoped to introduce place markers that would rekindle historical associations with these physical spaces. The sentiment that inspired the raising of the monument in 1914 was dual-purposed: to generate interest in the people of Perth about their own past, and to attract visitors to the town due to the lost built heritage that was seen as a challenge for the town to overcome, and is perhaps still considered such today. These dual challenges arguably are ones that many in Perth might still relate to, and particularly in a post-pandemic period, the focus on making locations and venues attractive to visitors, both local and incoming, to revitalise trade and business is central to local, regional and national bodies. However, generating meaningful interaction with the past, if done sensitively and collaboratively, can offer a means of engaging people in and over a longer term and in hopefully more transformative ways. Robert Isherwood argues that providing people with opportunities to discover unknown or lost heritage in their place and the process of historical narrative construction can be critical tools in the present. In his reflections on rediscovering and making memories in ethnographical research around community archaeology projects, he suggests that lost heritage sites, particularly in urban landscapes, have a particular appeal and offer the potential to promote means of connecting people to place and assisting in creating and reforging community identity. These conclusions are drawn from the experience of community archaeology groups specifically, but it's possible to broaden the conclusion to incorporate the potential of place-centered public history more broadly. There are similarly important examples of archive-based projects, such as those around the Argyll State Papers, which were funded by Heritage Lottery funding between 2017 and 19, that illustrate the potential for enhanced social cohesion, increased association with place and enabled communities through collaborative activities on archival collections in a geographically dispersed region like Argyll. Perth's Charterhouse is lost, but can its rediscovery of its past historical narrative offer a means of awakening connections to place in the present? In what ways might collaborative and co-designed activities centred on archival materials offer opportunities for enabling Perth's communities and supporting community cohesion in the challenges of modernity of a post-pandemic world? Our hope moving forward is that we will be able to offer some answers to some of these questions with our project as we continue our activities over the future months and years. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Lucy. That's fantastic. And yes, great to see all that and to hear about your ongoing project. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for questions. So I'll just ask people if you can just to use the hand raising icon function if you have a question and or wave. Oh, David, straight in there with question number one. So over to you, Dave.
Thanks, Lucy. I found that totally fascinating. Excuse me. I was wondering, looking at recusancy or immediate post-Reformation Catholicism, people tend to focus on the Northeast and the Highlands. Did Perth retain an indigenous Catholic community in the later 16th century? Is there evidence of that at all?
It's something we really want to look into more. It as sort of like the epicenter of the Reformation. It's often presumed that there wouldn't be, but I think that's one of the things. So we're waiting to hear from the Scottish Graduate School about a PhD application that we've put in collaboratively with Culture Perth and Kinross. And one of the things that we're particularly interested in is that level of how Protestant was Perth in that period after the Reformation is something that we're really interested to explore further. But the answer to that question I cannot give you just now.
Well, thank you, Lucy. Other questions? I suppose I could nab one as chair. I mean, well, the obvious question that you can, I think you did touch upon this, but I just thought a bit more detail. But why if the Carthusian priories were mostly rural or out the way, why does James decide I'm going to stick it right here, right next to this bloody great urban community, which, as you say, causes potential issues? Is it purely about the king demonstrating his power and his wealth and things, or are there other things going on?
I think that Perth, one of the reasons for the project is how important Perth actually is to the crown in Scotland, not just to James, but the previous Stuarts and also David II, to a certain extent as well, is starting to make this move towards Perth as well. And if James the First hadn't have been murdered there, who knows what would have happened in terms of Perth's history and how it might have developed in comparison to Edinburgh, had that have been the case. But there is definitely a sort of congruence of everything royal around Perth at this time, and I think that's part of it. I think that it's also I think it is that they want it to be visible. It's on one of the main roads into the town, and it would have been very obvious. I think that it's not the only one that's built near a town by then, and one of the things I want to do a lot more of and haven't had a chance yet is to do more comparisons with why the London Charterhouse is built where it is, because the London Charterhouse would have been not dissimilarly on the edge of London at the time that it was built. It's nowhere near the edge now, obviously, but it would have been somewhere near the edge when it was built. So I'd like to do more comparisons between, because that wasn't founded by a royal, that was founded by a knight. So I want to look at sort of why that choice was made, because I think there's more records of the founding sort of period of that one, which is one of the challenges that we have with the Charterhouse. A lot of the evidence that I have is actually in the run up to the Reformation, and it's just after the Reformation when they're sort of divvying the land back up again. We've got the license at the start, and we've got a couple of the initial grants that they're given in the 1420s or 30s. We don't have good royal records from that period to know how much James actually invested in it, which is very disappointing. But we also don't have from the amount of land they're able to give out when they're taking it apart, it was given a lot, and we don't have as many of it being given the things originally as we do as them being taken away. But I think that thinking about Scotland being the towns being a lot smaller as well is probably something to think about in terms of Perth, while being one of the most important towns, was still relatively small. So whether they'd have not worried as much about it. But the Carthusians came and checked the site. So they didn't reject that site as a space that they could set the Charterhouse up. So I think that it's because by that point there were more that were near or not far away from towns. And I think one of the things I find really, they'd already got 2 friaries out on the edge of Perth. By that point, you've already got Black Friars and White Friars, and then later you get Grey Friars as well. I think it just speaks to the wealth of Perth that essentially quite small town, which is, if you put all of the monastic institutions into the walls of Perth, they'd be bigger than it. That the people of Perth and the surrounding area are wealthy enough to support 4 houses like that is quite remarkable. But I think the answer as to why it's there probably has a lot to do with James, to be honest. Has a lot to do with James. Yeah.
Excellent. No, thank you. I'll need to have a word with you another time about the importance of Perth to Scots Kings and moving away. Ian.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ian, and thanks very much for that, Lucy. It was a really interesting talk. You won't be surprised to hear that I'm interested in the heritage side of things and thinking kind of critically about the use and abuse, I suppose, of heritage. And as I know, there's been a lot of recent scholarship that makes kind of the idea of a sense of inheritance from the past much more problematic than we might have hitherto imagined. And one of the things that has been long established is that whilst, yes, heritage can cause a sense of identity through a sense of inheritance, but it can also disinherit as well. And they call this kind of a sense of dissonance within the heritage realm, I suppose. And I'm just wondering if you guys are talking about that, thinking about whether kind of a religious inheritance can disinherit as much as it can create a sense of shared identity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's definitely something we've thought about a lot in terms of the the focus of the project initially, when we were thinking about, because we when we were there was the reasons we sort of were drawn towards it was its lost nature as much as anything else, I think, and the fact that for Perth, in comparison to Edinburgh or Stirling or any of the other sort of, there's a lack of its medieval heritage in built form, that even if that built form has then been vastly modified in later eras, that there's that was missing from Perth, and that was we had a lot of conversations with local societies around Perth, historical societies and archaeological societies, and actually with one of the school outreach things that we did quite early on, in terms of whether that, like the knowledge that people had about the medieval past of Perth. And we did walking tours in the town, taking people round. This was Richard, not me. I'm not very good at the walking tours. But he did walking tours round Perth so that he could demonstrate how the medieval layout is. It's still there. You can follow the medieval streets around. It's just that other than St John's Kirk, there's nothing medieval on the surface. I think that the fear that you have about, like, whether a religious institution would have that sense of dissonance is one that we've thought about quite a lot. But the conversations that we've had so far suggest that that isn't something that people are particularly like. The questions that I mean, the first talk that I ever did, when reflecting on some of the early research, 3 people in the audience came trotting up and asking us to dig up their gardens. So I get the impression that they're just quite interested to have medieval history on their doorstep. And we also haven't, well, we do talk about who the Carthusians were, and what their purpose was, and why they were different from other monastic institutions, and therefore why people should be interested in them. It's more, for me anyway, it's more about the way that these different groups of people in medieval society interacted with one another, which can have a lot to say about how modern groups interact with one another as well, I think. So for me, it's more about how did these austere individuals, most of whom weren't really allowed out of weren't supposed to go out of that physical space, how did they interact, and how did people in the borough find out about them and want to give them funds? So I think it's about the interaction between people that we're really interested in. Definitely me, anyway, in terms of why that institution was chosen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely. And I was just reflecting further on 2 things, really. First of all, clearly, the Carthusians weren't short of a bob or two. Given the kind of the way they expanded over the years, but also, I guess, in your talks and things, and in your engagement with people, what you're coming up against is the age-old problem of the social scientist. Really, you're only getting people coming to these things who are interested to come. You're not getting to the people who just aren't interested, and to do that is a major challenge, of course. And yes, not one that you're currently funded to do, I'm sure.
No, but it's definitely something we were thinking, like, because obviously we've had various attempts to get funding larger pots of money for this project, and one of the biggest steps, which was definitely trying to run before we could walk, and we now know that, but that project would have had was very much linked up with social scientists at Stirling, and the education unit at UHI. So trying to think more about in the history side of it actually got squashed quite into a little corner. It was bizarre how it happened over the course of the project. But the real focus that we had there was that really difficult question, Ian, about how do you speak to people who wouldn't necessarily automatically come to these events anyway. In what ways can you do that? And Culture Perth and Kinross, through the work that they already do, make, obviously, because of their remit, have to widen audiences. It's a part of their remit, so they're constantly seeking new connections. And they had, so for instance, they had connections with schools that were really useful. They were the first ones that we used, but we were also looking. They did a really interesting project with different communities who'd moved into Perth in the last sort of 20 to 30 years. They'd got a project about finding your past in Perth, in terms of sort of people coming into the area. So we'd got, pandemic did a lot of damage to a lot of those projects as well. So those connections have sort of been stunted as well. But those were the types of things that we were seeking to do, was to sort of, once we'd done sort of the groundwork, was to make those connections with those groups through the gatekeepers that we had at Perth and Kinross.
Good stuff. Thank you, Lucy. Nicola.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think it's just following on from that quite nicely in terms of the future direction of travel and where this is going, because I think that'd be really interesting. I know there's obviously lots of possibilities and lots of dependent on funding and dependent on other things, but yeah, where are some of the ways you're going to go with it?
I think that some of the ways are currently having to sit on a tentative footing, of which I'm not allowed to say too much at the moment. There's I think the one of the key things that we wanted to do with the exhibition was to have follow-on events from the exhibition. So one of the things that I did was to do feedback forms that thankfully lots and lots of people filled out, and it had a question on it asking whether if we were to run another event or activity or discussion or around one of the documents or collections of documents that you've seen in the exhibition today, which one would you choose and why? And everyone filled that box out. It was brilliant. So I'm sitting down and I'm collecting them into groups, and thinking about whether we could do more events with Culture Perth and Kinross on those, and if so, how we might go about choosing from those that were proposed by the different attendees, because I'd like to get more speaking to Ian's point, I'd like to get more people involved in identifying which of those documents we use. We've obviously got it to a certain number already, but maybe thinking about using social media to do that, maybe thinking about using networks that Culture Perth and Kinross already have, maybe doing a poll that went out to primary schools or a poll that went out to secondary schools, or thinking about the age that we'd want to engage with and that sort of thing. So I think that we're thinking of ways to utilise what we've done in that exhibition and build on it with Culture Perth and Kinross. We just don't know what that'll look like yet. We're sort of in discussions with them about that. There's the application that we've currently got in with the Scottish Graduate School of Arts and Humanities for a collaborative doctoral award with Culture Perth and Kinross, and also with Stirling, obviously, because Richard's involved in that as well. And that's around lay piety and some of those questions that David asked about Catholicism and Protestantism, but also about how the destruction of religious buildings affects the way that people practice religion. How were they practicing it beforehand? How were they practicing it after? How did they what happened to all the money that they beneficently gave to all of these places? What did they give it to when those monastic institutions had gone, and that sort of thing? But also that project really focused on an objective that the archive and the museum have mentioned to us on numerous occasions, which is bringing more direct connections between the two collections that they have, and using both collections and thinking about the material and the archival. And it would also support the archive in working on a cataloguing project. That would be part of it in terms of the materials they have on the Charterhouse, because they're all in different collections, but it's about, and religious institutions generally, they're across a lot of collections, but making sure that the collections that they are across have clear enough cataloguing details that if people are looking for religious institutions, they can find them, because at the moment they're not separated out in any way. So yeah, there's quite a lot going on in that project itself, hopefully. And then we've also been approached to get involved in helping when they open the Perth City Hall Museum with some of the events that they have in 2024, but that's all very much in the long pipeline at the moment. So there's quite a few things going on. I mean, if Richard was here, Richard would probably say that his dream is to make sure that we have some community archaeology in this project as well. So that is something that we've been consistently seeking funding to do. And I think that having both the element of community archive and archival work and community archaeology would really be what we'd like to do. But then again, it's waiting for the right time to find the right funding bid for both of those things. So yeah, lots of ideas and not a lot of cash is where we are at the moment.
The usual state of academia, but no, all very exciting anyway, Lizzie. David, did you have another question? Or you?
Yeah, I thought I just was I thought it was so fascinating the way you actually bridged history and memory, and I find that absolutely fascinating. In a way, we're talking about them as separate things, or history and heritage, but bringing in those archival sources from the 17th century and 18th century about the way people remembered it, I think that it's quite a challenging thing to do. But I wondered if there's more of that in the Kirk session records, for example. Records relating to how people referred to the place. Absolutely brilliant stuff. I thought that was so fascinating.
It's definitely a road I want to go down more. I feel like I have very much only scratched the surface in the things that I pulled out for the exhibition, and that I know I have things that weren't in the exhibition because the documents weren't in good enough condition, and we were concerned about putting them out. There was also some things that we were just like where they were like this whole bundle talks about it, but I don't have time to get through that bundle to figure out which is the important one to put into the exhibition. So I know there's quite a lot, and that was just from quite a surface level search, I would say, in terms of me trying to find where I could find references to the Carthusian Charterhouse in a collection that they have admitted is not as well catalogued as they would like. So, but I would really like, we found some really interesting references to Pomerium, actually, so the orchard area in the 19th century, and they're talking about a well in the Pomerium area that's got full of rubbish, and it should be removed, and we think it might be a much older well. So there's things like that where there's lots of connections that are going on for much later. So I think that I think I've just scratched the surface in terms of that kind of thing, and that's why we'd let get lots more people involved to help me look.
Fantastic stuff. Right. Well, thank you very much, Lucy. I think we'll draw things to a close. But thanks for a fantastic paper and really exciting stuff. Let's hope some generous benefactor swoops in and gives you all the money you need, and then you won't have anything to worry about. And that'll keep you busy for the foreseeable. Thank you all very much for coming out this evening. I hope Storm Auto, when it hits at some point tonight, it doesn't blow you all the way. Just to flag up as well that our next seminar will be on Thursday, the 23rd of March at 7 p.m. And that'll be by Dr. Deb Roy, who will speak to the theme of decolonize mosquitoes, which is she'll look at mosquitoes in British India and focus on themes of invisible labour, descent, and recolonization. So very different stuff from tonight, but yeah, interesting nonetheless. But yeah, thank you all very much, and thank you again, Lucy, and we shall see you again.
Thank you, everybody, for coming along. That was really great to have you here. Thank you.
Bye, folks.